You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I'm Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again for another week. We're doing this a day early. If you're listening to this a day early, I guess. I'm getting ready to leave to Kansas City, so I wanted to get this out before I did that and not have to travel with all sorts of suitcases and everything. So we're just going to do this at home. Makes it so much easier. All right, we're going to just jump right into this. Today we're going to do a little recap of the NFL Combine and how the Utah players did. We'll get an update on the Red Rocks and women's basketball team, and then we'll finish with a defensive look at our position previews. So we're going to look at the defensive line, namely defensive tackle and defensive end. So we're going to jump right into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way, because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, just as a reminder, you can also subscribe to this channel on YouTube at Utah Checkdown. Soon enough, we're going to start doing some videos and getting those posted. So just trying to get some things worked out, and we'll get that. But you can still listen to it on YouTube if that's where you want to live. But we'll kind of get things moving that way as well, so go subscribe there. All right, real quick kind of note, since we talked last week, I mentioned about official visit seasons kind of heating up with players starting to put their calendars together, and last week Utah had 12 players scheduled to visit in the months of May and June, They're now up to 20, so that'll continue. Like I said, this gets up to about 40 to 50, depending on how much Morgan Scalley wants to bring in and the types of players that they can bring. But given Utah's success last year, 11-2, much better trajectory for the program after last season as compared to the year before, where they went 5-7. There's potential where you can get some bigger name players, some little bit more interest into this, especially as you can build the momentum and everything that way. So curious to see how that comes together. But right now they're beefing up with the offensive line. There's been a lot of good visitors scheduled from that group, and as we get closer to that in the later months, as we get into like April, we'll start breaking those down a little bit more to show who's coming and kind of some of the important names to follow and look at. So we've got that. All right, let's jump into the NFL Combine, and for there was 5 players from Utah that went, and for the most part, it was essentially just the offensive tackles that really did most of the work. Dallin Bentley did some work as well, but for the other 2, they mostly just did the interviews, were part of the Combine in a participation role in terms of interviews and stuff that way, but did not participate in any of the drills. So not sure exactly why they were told not to participate in drills. Quite honestly, Logan Fano and Lander Barton may be a little bit slower in some of those, the 40 drill, for example, and so maybe there was a decision not to do that at the NFL Combine. We'll see. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't had a chance to talk to their agents or different things that way to see what's going on, but that is the case for them. The big highlight here were the offensive tackles, and the testing took place on Sunday, and Spencer Fano coming into the NFL Combine was somewhere around a top 5 pick. Some had him a little bit lower, easily inside the top 10, and he had a day. Honestly, like his testing was pretty great. He had a 4.91 40-yard dash, which was the second best offensive lineman. Once they got the official numbers in, Logan Jones of Iowa just barely beat him by 0.01. But still, you're the second best O-lineman in running. There's no way I could run that fast. And granted, I'm not an elite athlete, but the fact that you can have a 300-pound guy running it, under 5 seconds, the 40-yard dash is pretty impressive. He had the third best 10-yard split at 1.72 seconds. So Pretty impressive there. Some other measurables that were interesting is he had a 4.67 20-yard shuffle. That was fourth place among offensive linemen. And then a 7.34 second three-cone drill, which was first. So he beat that one decently well. So all in all, had a very solid day as an offensive tackle. He did take part in some other drills. For example, he took part in some center drills, seeing if he was amenable to shifting inside, and I'll get to why that's the case here in a second. But overall, when the NFL does their little scores for these players and their projections, right? You're looking at what they did on the field, some of the stuff that they've done at the collegiate level, how they tested, that kind of stuff, to kind of come to what they call this score. So there's a production score, an athleticism score, and a total score. And so, in the production score, he gets an 85, which is the top offensive tackle, athletic score, a 90, which is the second best offensive tackle. And then for a total score, he gets a 91, which is the number one offensive tackle. And they considered that to be an elite range. So all in all, there's a lot of positivity about Spencer Fano. You got a lot of upside from him and what he was able to showcase, which backed up a lot of what he did on the field already at Utah. And so there was a lot of, positive momentum for Spencer Fano. However, a lot of that changed, though, with his measurables in terms of his physical, his body, essentially. So the two things that the NFL looks for a lot, and the NFL is very particular about a lot of these measurables. They get really caught up on them, and that's not to say that there can't be guys that can break the mold and be effective with measurables that don't fit their model. It just they've kind of time and time again looked and seen that if a guy has X measurable, he's going to be able to be effective in what he does. So, for example, Spencer Fano's arms measured at 32 1/8 inch. The minimum that most NFL teams are going to look at for a tackle is 33 inches. So he's about an inch shorter there. The ideal range is 34 inches or longer. And that range right there is what gives a lot of people concern. Secondly, his hands are only 9 inches, and the ideal size for that is 9.5. And you may say, why hands? Quarterback, maybe that makes more sense. It's really just about leverage and different things that way as it relates to being a technician as an offensive lineman. And so as that stands, he had great numbers. He's obviously great in terms of what he does on the field, but there's giving a lot of NFL GMs a little pause based on his arms and his hands. And that, is cause for concern for some players. Is he going to be the top offensive tackle taken off the board now? Who knows? There's been one. I've only seen one projection so far. A lot of the places that do these NFL projections for the draft, they haven't released their latest ones coming off of the NFL Combine. There's only one, and one of them was a CBS guy, but there are three other guys that they use for CBS didn't have theirs updated yet. And so this had him dropping to 10th at the Chiefs. Obviously would be a great landing spot, but, curious to see what happens there. Chad Reuter, the draft analyst for the NFL, said Fano had an outstanding workout on Sunday, but his measurements are cause for concern, at least when it comes to his potential to protect the edge in the pros. You can kind of look at him as the guy, Will Campbell, who was taken number 4 last season to the Patriots. He struggled a bit. Granted, it's not a one-to-one thing, right? Just because he had similar measurables in terms of his arms and hands doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to Spencer Fano is going to struggle at the NFL level as well. But I think, there's patterns there where a lot of people look at and say, okay, you can have athleticism and you can have, the measurables that we want with the quick speed and the 20-yard shuttle and the 3-cone drills, those things. But I think the measurables in terms of his arms and hands are going to make it much tougher for Spencer to maybe get a little bit higher than was expected. Now, with that said, what that may mean is that Spencer Fano shifts inside. So maybe at the NFL, he's a guard. Maybe he's a center, and he's open to that. He talked to the NFL and said that he's open to that kind of move, but that limits, obviously, maybe where a team may want to draft. Most teams are going to look for an offensive tackle before they're looking for a guard, but that's not to say that teams aren't going to take him high. I still think there's value in Fano being a top 10 pick. I would be surprised if he slips out of the first round or even falls too far because of his athleticism and just what he's done on the field. But, crazier things have happened in the NFL draft where teams will look at one little thing, one little red flag that they identify, and suddenly that you see a guy slide. So I don't project that with Spencer Fano. There's always a need for talented offensive linemen, and similar to the collegiate level where you're just trying to find the 5 best players. Now, granted, some of those players are already projected in certain spots, but I think whether they slate him as an offensive tackle or an offensive guard or even center for that matter, he's still going to be a valuable piece for whatever franchise he goes to. And so there's opportunities there. Really curious to see as we get closer to April where the consensus is with him. How do teams evaluate him? Now that teams have kind of come back from the NFL Combine, you're going to start hearing news about how they felt with different things. So really curious to see what happens with Spencer Fano. I don't think it's going to be a huge problem for him, but at the same time, maybe he doesn't go as high as many expected simply because of those measurables, which you may find frustrating. That's just the nature of the NFL. You're investing millions of dollars into these players, and you want to make sure that you're hitting. Spencer still, at least everything tracks to show that he's going to be a valuable asset in the NFL, but you don't blame some of these NFL GMs for passing on somebody if he doesn't fit the model that they want. So there was Spencer Fano. Caleb Lomu had an equally talented day, but I think the overarching theme here with Caleb is he's still developing, right? The potential for Caleb is, I've heard from a lot of people that his ceiling is probably higher than Spencer Fano's, but he's just not quite there developmentally yet with what Fano is right now today. They come from the same class, but as you remember, Caleb Lomu came in later to the year, so he joined in fall, whereas Spencer Fano joined in the spring, and so it took him a whole year to get there. So he only has 2 real full seasons under his belt. Obviously really solid and really talented, but not yet to the level of Spencer Fano. So curious to see what happens with Caleb Lomu. There's still expectations that he could be a first rounder, but there's a lot of offensive linemen that had a great showing at the NFL Combine where maybe he slips to an early second day type pick. We'll see. His production there, so he had a 4.99 40-yard dash, which was the 9th best of offensive linemen. Some other things that were interesting. He had a 9'5" broad jump, which was 6th. His arms measure at 33.38 or 3/8. So he's in that minimum range, closer to kind of the minimum of what is ideal at that 34 inches. So he's got that. And then the ideal range for the hands, as I mentioned, was 9.5, and he's got exactly 9.5. So, he at least fits the measurables of an offensive tackle in terms of what NFL teams are looking. Still kind of more on the lower end, but not necessarily in a bad way. So I don't think you're going to see him slipping as it relates to that. I think the biggest issue for Caleb is maybe other offensive linemen having a better day at pro day. Now, with that said, production on the field at the collegiate level mixed with what you did at the NFL Combine is going to be a big thing. I don't think there's any necessarily red flags with Caleb other than just he's a little bit immature. Doesn't sound like that doesn't sound right because he is a mature guy, but I think in terms of how the NFL teams are going to produce and kind of what they're projecting on a guy that can come in immediately, he still needs that development. So maybe it's just, I don't even want to say developmentally immature because I don't think that's the case. I don't think that accurately describes it, but I think you just essentially need somebody that's going to take a little bit longer to reach his ceiling. But once he reaches his ceiling, I think there's a lot of belief that he can be a stable force in the NFL for a long time. His scores from the NFL, production score was 76th, which was 3rd among offensive tackles. 89 in his athleticism score, and then as a total score an 81, which is 3rd best for the offensive tackles, which was rated as good. So just barely under elite. Well, not just barely, but he's solidly in the good category. And so, there's still some upside there, still things that he needs to work on, but I think you didn't see anything that necessarily took you away from Caleb Lomu. I think it's necessarily just the people that are around him that maybe showed up a little bit more that could push him down. So we'll see. Like I said, we'll get a little bit closer to if he's going to be a first-day pick. He was already kind of maybe top 25, bottom end of the first round. We'll see if he slips out, but either way, like Caleb's going to have a long career in the NFL. Barring him just not being able to acclimate to the NFL, I don't see that, but I think you're going to see a lot of opportunity available to him. Going later in the draft may afford him to be in a better landing spot where he can learn some of these things. And so I don't think there's a bad, there's not a downside here with Caleb. I think it's just a matter of kind of where he fits. There's going to be a little bit more questions as it relates to kind of who he is, and, we'll see what happens. Other players, like I said, Dallin Bentley was the only one that really took part in the actual drills. And he had a 4.62 40-yard dash, which was the 8th best for tight ends. There were some pretty elite tight ends this year. And overall, just had a really solid day. It wasn't, there wasn't anything that necessarily stood out and said, hey, this is phenomenal, but he didn't hurt himself either. And I think that's good for him because he only has one real year of tape at Utah. That 2024 season really didn't showcase who he was simply because Utah had its own problems. And so last year obviously helped him a ton, but it's only 1 year. And so there's going to be some people there's going to be some hesitation there. He is older because he's a return missionary. So there's going to be some stuff there, but he showed that he can do it, right? He's at his prime in terms of, or at least reaching his prime in terms of who he can be as a player. Now it's just a matter of being able to get the right fit. His grades, he came in with a total score of 75, which is that good category. So I think there's going to be some interest there. There's potential he could be a day 2 pick, probably a 3rd round guy, maybe sneaks into the 2nd round. I'd be surprised, but we'll see. I think, like I said, there wasn't anything that necessarily hurt him. I just think there's some pretty talented tight ends in this draft class, and so I'm curious to see where he's slated. Some have had him as the 3rd best tight end. Some have him a little bit more later in the mix. Really fascinated to see where he fits, but I think he's helping himself, right? I think with what he did on the field this last year and what he can do on the field in terms of the NFL Combine drills, he's helped himself, but how much remains to be seen. So curious there. And then there's Logan Fano and Lander Barton. Neither one participated in those drills. We'll see if they take part in pro day stuff and what they do there. Hard to really gauge where they're at. I think Lander is considered the more draftable player here, but by not much. They grade him as an average score, and Logan Fano is below average. So there's some uphill climb that both of these players have to do. I think Lander has the potential, with obviously brothers in the league, that kind of gives him a leg up to say, hey, he can do it. But we'll see. I'm really curious to see where these two fall. Is an undrafted free agency better for them? I don't know that they even get that far. I think Lander could get into 5th round territory, even Logan to some extent. Curious to see where they fit, but we don't really know where they stack up compared to others in terms of the measurables because we didn't get to see it at the NFL Combine. But that's not to say that they can't be around there. It's just for whatever reason, the advice that they were given was not to participate at the NFL Combine. All right, let's shift off from that. Like I said, we'll get more into the evaluations of that and all that other stuff as it gets closer to the draft. But we've gone on enough with that, and so let's move on. All right, let's talk a little Red Rocks. Before I get into them, though, today's Tuesday, Iowa State announced today that it is disbanding or shuttering the gymnastics program. You may, if you follow gymnastics, you may know that Iowa State canceled its season a couple weeks in. Utah competed against them, but the equipment it didn't feel like it was up to snuff. Don't even get me started with Denver last week, but that's a different conversation. But Iowa State, they basically ended their season. We're looking out for the safety of their players, and then today announced that they're shuttering the program. They'll look to add a different program for some other athletic team, but gymnastics will no longer be a part of Iowa State. Now, Iowa State was not some behemoth in gymnastics. But what this does for the Red Rocks now is it limits now more teams that you can compete with because it's already a smaller conference. There's already kind of a lower level tier of the competition in this conference. And so this really takes, what am I trying to say? The Big 12 takes a hit here, and most notably Utah, because they don't have more competition to do it. And so I think, I'm really curious to see how Utah tries to finagle this. Can they get into another conference, even if it's just for gymnastics? Because I just don't see the Big 12 being a viable solution moving forward. Your biggest competition over the last few years, if you're looking back even before Utah got into the conference, obviously it would have been Oklahoma, but Oklahoma's in the SEC. It's really Denver. You might get something from one of the Arizona schools. They've been kind of up and down. BYU kind of flirts with some stuff, but they still haven't been to that level where Utah's at. And so it's been an interesting situation to see where this team competes. You can argue, does this hurt the Red Rocks in terms of level of competition and not being able to compete with teams that are at an elite level? Maybe. Is this push Utah to say, hey, we're just going to go, independent in gymnastics? Does that help? I'm really fascinated to kind of see the options and what would be available to the Red Rocks. But right now, losing another team, even if it is a team that isn't necessarily going to compete, hurts the overall competitive advantage for a Big 12, which is admittedly already in a small space. With that said, the Red Rocks did win their second straight regular season title on Sunday with a win over Denver. They got their second highest road score of the season with a 197.2. This was to be expected, even with the frustrations that Utah's had this year and kind of the up and down ride. They were they were their clear favorite. There wasn't really any competition in terms of Big 12 competition. And so when they get into the actual Big 12 championship, it's expected that Utah should win that as well and win their second straight actual title. So, it's a good spot for Utah in the sense that they're the cream of the crop, but they're already the cream of the crop no matter what conference they're going to be in, right? You can argue that the Big 10 and the SEC obviously has more depth, especially in the SEC where you've got Oklahoma and LSU and Florida and Georgia. There's a lot of competition there. But this is a sport where you're not necessarily judged amongst other teams. It's really just judged amongst yourself. And yet, when you have competition that doesn't push you, I think that kind of also limits what Utah can do, right? They're still striving for their best, and obviously they're competing amongst themselves. But at the same time, when you go into a meet knowing that you don't have to be your best, I think that does something to you psychologically. You go into that meet with UCLA, which has been a proven rival for years, even more so than BYU in gymnastics. You go into that knowing that there's something on the line. Now, there's not in the sense this year that there's not anything on the line in terms of conference titles, but at the same time, you've got something on the line because you're trying to prove yourself against the best. And both teams are trying to do this. They've both had, individual successes against each other that help, but it just hasn't been that case this year for Utah simply because they don't have that level of competition. Now, Utah will still play UCLA this year, but like I said, it's out of conference and it's not necessarily something that has a conference ties to it. So really curious to see how that goes. There's still a couple meets this week. There's West Virginia and BYU coming to the Huntsman Center. BYU had to come to Utah again because of that Iowa State canceling of the season. Utah was good enough to be able to say, hey, we'll give you an opportunity to come and compete with us again. But now that adds a little bit more, I don't want to call it stress, but it adds a little bit more to that meet now because it's a tri meet, which is just its own unique, set of problems. You go against West Virginia, two teams that you can beat, but what does this do for you? So that'll be that case. The Red Rocks are your regular season Big 12 champions, but looking for more. Now let's shift to women's basketball. Women's basketball tournament kicks off this week. Like I said, I'm heading to Kansas City. I will be covering BYU and Utah for KSL.com. So I will be covering both teams, and it matters even more this year because there's a high probability that BYU and Utah will meet up in the second round. So just real quick, some deets. This is at the T-Mobile Center in Kansas City. If you're out there, it's a fun vibe. They'll do a lot of good things, looking to go get some barbecue, check out some of the scenes. The Big 12 is really excited about this LED court by ASB Glass Floor. It's all digital. You can have the Huntsman Center look on the court. You can have any kind of look on the court, which is fun. I think it's not earth-shattering like the conference hopes it is. I think it can provide more sponsorship opportunities. Yesterday, they announced Windex as the official glass cleaner of the conference. Obviously, that's more in play because of the glass floor, but just fun nonetheless. But there's stuff like that for monetary-wise where you can throw in a bunch of sponsors, right? You can get the look of the court different. In terms of practice, they can actually use this court to test their shooting. So on that end, there's a lot of things where if you had this in a practice facility, and Utah got to practice with this down in Orlando, they were encouraged to use this to kind of prepare themselves for the Big 12 tournament. You can go and get individual shot production. You can kind of see different things from the floor where it can track different things in game. They're not necessarily going to track a lot of those things for teams, but I think that opens itself up to different possibilities in the game of basketball where you can start tracking things. So if you look at it from an analytics point of view, it has a lot of value, and it would be really interesting to see teams kind of shift to these glass floors. Like I said, sponsorships, obviously that's a great opportunity and you can kind of filter some things out, but at the same time, it's still another basketball floor. Now there is one nuance here, whereas on a hardwood floor where it's, you kind of, when you stop, you just kind of, it's a halt stop. Apparently this glass floor has a little bit more give, and so you kind of slide a little bit more. Curious to see if that has any issues for the players. It's minimal. It's more of a cushion effect than anything, but curious to see if that has any effect on the players as they go through it. It's an equalized thing because every player is going to have to do it, but it's going to be a different look. And so, fascinating to see there. So tomorrow I'll be watching BYU as they take on the other Cougars, the Red Cougars, in a 9-16 matchup. This game will play at 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time. The winner of this will go on to play Utah. So this game is important for Utah to pay attention to. Obviously, BYU has beat Utah twice this year. It's been kind of a crazy game because on paper, Utah was the better team both times. And the first time, Utah blew a lead in Provo. The second time, Delaney Gibb just could not miss from anywhere on the court. She's a phenomenal player and just absolutely obliterated Utah in kind of everything that they wanted to do and killed them. So Houston, on the other hand, bottom of the league, really struggled this year, honestly looking to probably just finish it out, get it done with. That's not to say that they can't beat BYU, but I think that would be a really fascinating development to this. But I think we're looking at a BYU-Utah rivalry game in the second round for a chance to go to the third round and play on Friday. So, Utah gets that first round bye. They squeaked in with that bye simply because Arizona State lost to Texas Tech on Sunday, and so that, based on the tiebreakers and everything, pushed Utah into that seed and allowed them to get that first round bye with number 5 Texas Tech, number 6 Colorado, and number 7 Iowa State. And whoever wins that game, so BYU or Utah, I'm just going to say BYU because I assume that it'll be either one of those two. This will be a great opportunity for Utah to get that third chance to get a win and move on. The winner of that game moves on to Friday, where they'll play the number 1 seed TCU. You may remember that Utah did beat TCU earlier in the season. They did really well against Olivia Miles and locked her down, arguably the best player in the conference. And so, you get that rematch. Does it go the same way? It'd be interesting, right? Curious to see what happens there. But TCU's the number 1 seed, and we'll be waiting for whomever comes out of that second round game. Other top seeds, number 2, West Virginia, number 3, Baylor, and number 4, Oklahoma State. So if Utah / BYU or whomever comes out of that game were to beat TCU, on docket would be West Virginia as the 2 seed. So that's what it would be for the semifinals, which would be Saturday, and then the championship game on Sunday. So Utah, quite honestly, in terms of what they need to do, they're on the bubble. And a win over BYU isn't necessarily going to suddenly get you off the bubble. It'll help, though. And so I think in this scenario, you've got to be able to get that win over BYU. That's the team that you need to be there. Beating Houston isn't necessarily going to help you. So you do need BYU to advance. You do need then to beat BYU. And at the very least, you've got to remain competitive against TCU. Obviously, if you get a win, I think that I wouldn't call it a lock, but I think that would go a long way to the committee to show that Utah deserves to be in the NCAA tournament. But it's going to be tough, right? And so I think if Utah beats BYU and then goes into that third round and gets blown out by TCU, there's going to be a lot more noise to say, Utah doesn't deserve an NCAA tournament appearance, which would be their fifth straight appearance. So, it's important. Does Utah have the depth and the ability to go deep in the tournament? Probably not. But I still think that's the goal, and that's where you want to be. You learn from that, you grow from that. And so I think that's obviously going to be the goal for Utah. It's the goal for any team, right? Like anybody saying that the NCAA tournament's not a goal is crazy. Nobody wants to play in the NIT. You'll play in it, but at the same time, this is a scenario where Utah needs to do a little bit more work to be able to get into the tournament and get off of the bubble. BYU's in a similar spot. They're just a little bit below Utah. So, you beat Utah again. I don't know that also adds much value because you've done it 2 times before. But at the same time, doing it a third time, it helps, especially if you can do it in a convincing way. And then you got to play TCU. So really fast, excuse me. Wow. I'm really fascinated with this women's tournament. This year, more than ever, I think it's a pretty wide open game. Really curious to see how this goes and to kind of take it in and get that Kansas City look and kind of all that is. So I'll provide some updates. I'll try to put some stuff on social media. I understand it. Many people are following the men's tournament more than the women's, but I think, this women's tournament is going to be very fascinating. And if you haven't had a chance to check out the women yet, especially if they're playing the game that Gavin Peterson wants them to play and the team, plays the way that they know that they can play, this can be a dangerous team. And quite honestly, they have the potential that they can win a championship. But if they don't show up and if they have some of these issues where they can't get their shooting to go, they become, much more static in what they do with their passing and then don't get the flow amongst the team, this can be a team that can absolutely just get destroyed. And so I think it's whichever team shows up in Kansas City will kind of be, you'll get the vibe early is what I'm basically saying. So we'll see what happens there and look forward to being in Kansas City to watch all this. All right, let's transition now back to football. So if you remember, we finished up the offensive position breakdowns last week, just trying to give you a look at who the potential starters are, the backups, who's basically in the room that you should be paying attention to. So today we're going to focus on the defensive line with defensive tackles and defensive end. Now, this is a group where I'm really fascinated to kind of see how this goes. There's proven commodities in terms of guys that have been able to play, but it's still not at a level where I think we have good understanding of what they can be. Last year, quite honestly, the defensive tackle room was just a real big disappointment. And so some of the problems that you saw at the linebacker level, they had some struggles because the defensive tackles weren't doing their job. They weren't getting the push that they needed to. They weren't getting tackles. And so you weren't getting that same level of competition that you're used to, which meant that the linebackers had a lot more work to do, which also exposed them in different areas. So this is a very vital position group this next year for Utah to develop. It's a position group that we've just kind of taken and granted for because it's just always produced. And look, like when we talk about this, it's still at a decent level compared to some of its peers in the Big 12 or even amongst the country. But clearly there was a big drop off in run defense last year, in generating havoc plays in that way. Your ends did really well. Obviously, John Henry Daly did a phenomenal off the edge. Logan Fano did great off the edge. Other players did well. But as a collective whole, this unit, it just didn't work the way that it needed to. And so there's going to be a lot of intrigue coming into spring camp with these defensive tackles. there's 4 guys that I've identified as being kind of in the mix for that starter role, or we'll call it the 2 deep, with a 5th player that I could put in there. Quite honestly, there's 2 other players you could, so 8, or what is that? No, 7. Sorry, 7 total players that I think can be in the mix there. But I'm really fascinated to kind of see how it all comes together. So to me, as the returners, the guys who have the leg up coming in is Pupu Sepulona, freshman coming in last year, played in 11 games, had 13 total tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 1 pass breakup, only had 137 snaps, and so there's still not a lot there, but his grades need to simply improve. There's a lot of stuff that he needs to improve on, but this is a guy that has only played football for a couple of years. He's mostly a basketball guy. If I remember right, I wrote a story on him in the fall, and talking to him, he said he played basketball his entire career and then decided to play football his senior year. So there's some development that still needs to go in, but there's clear, what am I trying to say here? It's clear that he is kind of one of the top guys there because of his athleticism and just what he's able to do, that if you can coach him up to be the guy that he needs to be, he can do it. It's just he hasn't had a lot of reps there yet. And so, is he going to be the starter, or can somebody push him over the edge there and push him into the second unit? Either way, I think you've got a guy that has a lot of potential that can do really well. I think they're going to work really hard this spring to be able to get him into the player that he needs to be now that they have a full year and kind of some teach tape that they can put out there to help with tackling and help with, pressures or whatever that may be, to be able to help him. So really curious with Pupu to see what happens there. Think he has a tremendous upside, and I think he can be a player that can be a fixture there if he can make those next steps. Next is Carson Kaufusi, young guy who got 177 snaps, 13 tackles, similar to Pupu. He had a half a sack last year. Better overall grades from PFF, especially tackling grades. He had a 78.5 grade there, but still is a player that needs to improve. But look, he was a freshman and he didn't get into a ton of opportunities. But I think he's, there's been a lot of talk about him as a player last year and kind of who he can be. I think, he's another player with tremendous upside, and if he can tap into that, and if he can get into that depth and kind of make the progress needed, you've got a 1-2 punch there with Pupu Sepulona and Carson Kaufusi. I think they can be the fixtures there on that line, but we're going to need to see it to believe it, right? And that's where, I don't necessarily doubt this unit, but until we can see it, I think there's going to be a lot of questions and a spotlight on this group simply because of that. Now, in that mixture is 2 guys that are transferring in Lucas Samsula and Jamal Wallace. So Samsula comes from Wyoming, had a lot of snaps, or at least more than these guys, 344 snaps. He grades out as the highest graded tackler of all of the players, and so there's potential there, and maybe that pushes him over the edge simply because he can be a dynamic tackler, which was something that Utah needed drastically. His pass rushing numbers aren't as great as some of the other players, but he's proven it at Wyoming to an extent. Had 15 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, and 1 QB hit. So, there's potential there as well. Does he fit in this immediately? He's going to have the whole year to be able to do it. So it's not for the sake of being able to understand it, but just curious to see kind of where he fits in relation to Pupu and Carson, and kind of what happens there. And then there's Jamal Wallace coming in from Tennessee. Didn't get a ton of snaps, only 78 snaps. So there's not a lot of tape on him, but I think there's belief that he can be another guy with his physical, measurements and stuff that way, where he can kind of be a bigger body in there that allows Utah to kind of clog up the lanes. So, those are the 4 that I kind of see as the projected 2 deep, see where they can be. Outside of that, as I've got listed as backups right now, but I'm curious with Jaira Moe where he fits. From San Jose State, had 213 snaps, 28 total tackles in 11 games, had 1.5 sacks, really solid grades on the defensive side, especially in run defense. His pass rush wasn't too bad either. And so you've got a player that has been pretty consistent at San Jose. Can he fit in that group as well? Is he going to be in that mix? Does he overtake one of these other players? I think that's a good problem for Utah to have. You also have a player who's produced. So it's still not that many snaps, but he's at least got some on tape where they can look at and say, hey, this is what you need to do. This is what we do at Utah. Where do they fit in, right? And so I think that group of 5 is probably in that mix, but I'm still keeping him outside in the backup range, but we'll see. I think there's a lot of potential there. And then the other 2 players is Semi Taulanga, who's obviously been spending some time on the offensive side of the ball as well. Do they make that a full-time transition under Kevin McGiven? And do they make him more of just that fullback role, utility player type guy? Or do they try to keep utilizing him in the defense? We don't really know. We'll see what happens there. And then Sione Matuapaka. I totally just butchered that name, but I'm not even going to try it again. So I know how to say it, but we're not going to try it again. That was a real bad effort. So also no reps last year. And, curious to see if he can get in there. Another freshman from last year. So curious to see what kind of development that he can make in the year that he got to watch. Where do they fit in? I think in spring is where we're really going to start to see these things come about. Curious to see if we hear either one of their names as it relates to the rest of the group, to see if they kind of step up. Really, really curious to see there. And then deep backups, you got Dylan Battle transferred in from an SEC school, hasn't really kind of factored in yet. Curious to see if he can get there. Was injured a bit. And then Mike Tatuoli, he's gotten played in 5 games, had 2 total tackles. And so there's potential that he can get in there as more of a depth guy. But I don't see him factoring into that as much unless he makes a big leap. So that's your defensive tackles. That's the room that I think is one of the most fascinating in all the team of what's going to happen. Obviously, wide receiver is going to be the more sexy position to pay attention to see if Utah can do it. But I think defensive tackle is going to be one where if you can get that solidified, I think everything else settles itself, right? The linebackers, you've got talent there. The corners, we'll get into that next week and talk about them, but I think they've got a lot of talent there, and you've got to trust Sharif Shah in what he does. I think he's proven it year in and year out that he can do it. He's learned that how to get these guys coming from the transfer portal and coach them up in a quicker manner. But we'll see. I think this is the group where how this group goes will be how the defense is next year. So if it can succeed, I think this defense can be pretty solid. Still a lot of younger players or guys with less experience, but I still think you can learn from what you had last year and develop off of that. Lastly, let's finish with the defensive ends. Defensive ends is going to be an interesting room because I think there's a lot of talent here, but it's still, I wouldn't call it unproven because a lot of these guys have had a lot of reps already. And a lot of these guys have been guys that there's been a lot of optimism about. So starting out, your 2 returners from last year, Lance Holtzclaw and Cash Dillon. Holtzclaw especially came on late and really kind of showcased himself. There was, some stuff that he did in the Las Vegas Bowl that really kind of set him apart. He had 341 snaps, 26 total tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, and 3 pass breakups. Decent grades from PFF, but still something that you'd want to see improve. His run defense was his highest graded metric from PFF, so good. But I think you still want to see more from him. I think this could be a breakout year for Lance Holtzclaw, especially with him being the guy. So he's a guy that I'm going to kind of focus in on because I think there's a lot of optimism about who he can be and what he can do for Utah. But I know that there's a ton of belief in who he can be. And so, it's his to lose, essentially. Where he fits on the line remains to be seen, but I think it's his to lose as one of the top guys to be able to get in there and mix it up. Now, Cash Dillon is another guy that we've been hearing from since he was a freshman. He's got undeniable talent. There's a lot of belief in who he can be. Last year, he had 340 snaps for 35 total tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 1 QB hit, and 1 forced fumble. So really did a lot. That's exactly what you want in a defensive end. You want him in that backfield. You want getting fumbles. You want QB hits. You want those sacks. Like, this is a guy that has really kind of showcased it, but at a smaller level. Can we see that at a higher level in terms of him being the guy? I think so. I think, when you give him the reins, I think that's going to change things a little bit to say, hey, you're the guy. And now you prepare that way. Whereas his grades are actually lower on average compared to Lance Holtzclaw, but I think he's been much more of a, disturber. Is that even a word? He disrupts more in terms of what he's able to disturb. Is that even a word? I don't know. He disrupts a lot. But I think, he's another guy that I think it's his to lose on the other side of what they can do. I think these two guys have proven they can do it. They've been in the system. They understand what's going on, but they have a guy that's coming in from the transfer portal, and Ethan Day from North Texas, who's had proven success there with 654 snaps, 53 total tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks, 8 QB hits, 1 fumble recovery. This is a guy that is going to make some noise as well. How does he factor into that? Is this one where Utah had a couple years ago where you had so much talent in the defensive end room where you're cycling them out a lot more? Or is he a guy that steals a spot? Right now I think those three are kind of the guys that are fighting for the starting reps, but I could see where there's a lot more fluidity there simply because Ethan Day is effective at what he does. I really love him on tape and what he's able to do. I think he's got a ton of potential, good grades from Pro Football Focus that can still improve, but a guy that I think can be an X factor for Utah if he factors into this team and really kind of showcases his talent. But I think, with those three alone, you've got some really solid opportunities available to you. Once again, still have to prove it as the guy, but I think Utah's in a good hands there in terms of what they're able to do. Now, the key backup here is Paul Fitzgerald. Does he factor in as kind of the two deep as well? He's been with Utah for a couple years now. Was a guy at Utah State that was a disruptor. Didn't really, he had some injuries last year. Had 80 snaps, 11 total tackles in what he did. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential there. I still want to see more from him to be able to say that he can beat out any one of those three. But I think he definitely has the potential to do it. It's just a matter of kind of where he fits in, what kind of level of progress that he's made. But the fact that you can have a good, solid two deep kind of shows that Utah's in a good position. So I think Utah's in a good spot here at defensive end, but this is one of those where, similar even to last year, where you wanted to see guys produce. John Henry Daly coming into the year, there was a high potential that he was going to not even be your guy. It could have been Lance Holtzclaw. It could have been Paul Fitzgerald. He just kind of took it over at the end of fall and then really kind of showcased his talent when he got into the games. And when those bright lights are on you and you can show up, that speaks to coaches a ton, right? Obviously, you have to do it in practice still to kind of give them confidence, but he was able to do it on the field in a way that just absolutely disrupted so many different players. So where do these players fit in? Really fascinated to kind of see the combinations there, who gets the starts, who's the two deep. Either way, I think you've got a good opportunity, on your hands for the defensive end room. And then you've got some really young players as your deep backups, right? So you have Nicholas Igwe, comes from Kilgore Community College, transferred in from there. Curious to see what he can do. What he can do from the JUCO level that translates there. Can he immediately kind of factor in? Or is this going to be a little bit more development? I'm going to guess a little bit more development just simply, but maybe he factors in. And then you've got 3 freshmen that are coming in that I think there's a lot of optimism about who they can be. It's just a question of kind of, how they're going to factor in. I see them as more depth players right now, but maybe there's one of those guys that comes in and really showcases themselves in a way that sets them apart. But like I said, I think this defensive end room is really solid. You've got a good group of players that can be effective for Utah. Can they get in the backfield? They've shown that they can. They're getting a bunch of sacks, especially in relatively limited compared to being true starters. They've been able to get in the backfield, get sacks, get QB hits. So really curious to see what happens there. Does Ethan Day factor in as one of the starters? I don't know, but I think this is a good room and a good defensive line in whole as it stands in terms of its collective. Like I said, defensive tackles is still going to be the biggest question for me. I still think that's the room that is going to make or break this Utah defense as it did last year, but I think there was enough stuff that Utah did last year that they could kind of absorb some of that, except late in the season when you did lose John Henry Daly, when things started to break down, you saw that really impact Utah a ton because they couldn't contain anything in the run game. If Utah can't contain anything in the run game, they're going to be in a world of hurt. Because I just think, they're going to be fairly solid in the secondary. I think what they're going to be able to do there is going to be pretty similar to what they did last year. So you've got that pretty well locked down, but if you can't get, if you have similar numbers to the run game as it was last year, teams are going to expose you quicker. Because last year they didn't really pick up on it until later in the season. This year, you're going to see a lot of that same stuff where you're going to test Utah early. You're going to try to get in there. Arkansas, they'd be crazy not to test it early and try to see if Utah has fixed that. And the fact that that's the second game of the season is going to be a big tell for Utah, because then you really get that true test of who these guys can be. So, really fascinated by this defensive line. Like I said, this is the biggest question that I have coming in for the defense, but we'll see. There could be other things, other weaknesses. There could be injuries. There could other things that happen in spring that kind of turn my attention. But as we go into spring, this is kind of where my attention's at. So that's it for today. Next week, we're going to finish the defensive side of the ball. So we'll go with linebackers and the secondary and really just kind of wrap that up before we get into spring camp. That's coming up here soon. And, we'll get pro days here soon. That's, I believe, March 19th. And we'll kind of get all that kind of stuff going on. But, we're humming along as we get closer to spring. I'll recap women's basketball and where they're at. Obviously, the men will have their tournament next week, but we can all kind of figure out where they're going to be. But that's kind of where we're at for Utah Athletics, and we'll continue to hum along with this stuff. So I appreciate you listening. As always, feel free to give any feedback or anything you want me to talk about, any questions you may have. I'd love to jump into them, especially in the off season where we can talk about it more. So with that, we'll sign off and have a great week.